Hi folks, today we're looking at the Archaeology of Religion, Part 3, the Temples of Ancient Egypt. Many of them being explored throughout the 18 and 1900s, and we look at a landscape full of great monuments, pylons, pyramids, and these temples, as you can see marked on the map. Many origins for ancient Egypt are very difficult to trace. But the first signs of the sense of temples, the sense of people's faith, rituals, what they believed, go back in the evidence stakes about 9,000 years ago. A map showing many sites related around the River Nile. But today we're going to look at, with a start at the Nabta Playa, marked at the bottom of the map here, towards the border of Sudan and Egypt, near the Aswan Dam. Showing Nabta Playa, a landscape which was set associated with its own lake at one time, freshwater lake, along the edges of the Sahara Desert. But 9,000 years ago in Egypt was a very different place from what it is today. And when you think about it, that landscape gradually dried up to about 5,000 years ago, where the Sahara is at the modern bounds where you see it today. Whenever you think about Egypt, you think about its gods: Amun, Anubis, Jeb, Horus, Isis, Osiris, Ra and Seth. But these were 8 of many thousands of gods that represented different things in ancient Egypt, even a god associated with people studying the past, i.e. archaeology. Amun, the king of the gods. One of my most famous gods must be Anubis, the god of cemeteries, the god of the underworld. And looking at Geb, the god of the earth. Horus, the god of the sky. That links us in with one of the early temples coming up. Isis, goddess of life, living. I'll mention living and life a fair bit. Ra, god of the sun. Seth, god of chaos. And Osiris, god of the dead. But today's more about talking about life, really. Chronologies of ancient Egypt are very difficult to follow and understand. Many recalibrated. The likes of the first dynasties of Egypt come into the vein and air of approximately 5,000 years ago, when we were just thinking about building the likes of Stonehenge. From Stonehenge immediately we look at something that are the precursors 9,000 years ago, the temples that we see dotted around Egypt. These stone circles, when you think about them, are very similar to the descriptions of our stone henge sites in Britain, where we think of them as early types of temples. We could think of them as early forms of religion, early forms of dedication, early forms of visiting life, death, understanding the stars, understanding everything. Some archaeologists believe that each of these stones, in a British context, however, would represent a family or an individual. We always assume, whenever we see these types of sites, that they're always associated with rituals, they're always associated with the priesthood, they're always associated with this and that. But I'm one of those archaeologists who believes that these sites are more about life. When we visit the likes of causewayed enclosures in our own society up to 6,000 years ago, we think of causewayed enclosures where people would have celebrated life, and those that had passed on, but in the present, in the living, had access to the bones, access to the skulls of those loved ones. But these, by far, have to be the early origins of those great temples that we do see in Egypt, developing from these stone circle sites, developing in the Sahara, as we see the evidence now, very close evidence being found, but also in the light of these sites being very close to water. Many archaeologists put 2 and 2 together and associate with the stars, the line of sight, the north, the east and the west axis. Sometimes these are archaeologists reconstructing these sites from very limited evidence, with no actual written evidence or understanding of these sites in a real, genuine context. So lots of archaeology is made up, but lots of it is actual fantasy. But when we talk about a temple, we think about, in my mind, life, living, celebrational, just being close to that representation of who we are. can see a map here starting 9,000 years ago before present in Egypt, where we see the first likenesses of sites developing into the human consciousness of our ancestors, not having any idea what they were doing, celebrating or building these sites. Then again, were these stone circles directly distant relatives of the temples is very much a guess. The likes of the first real temples being away from the circular form of worship, in the sense that everything seems to be circular, goes into the square rectangular form, coming up just to before 3,000 years BC, 5,000 years ago, running into the period of the early dynastic dynasties, running then into the old kingdoms. But this period of the early dynastic dynasties has to be enshrined. When we look at this, we look at towards the lower part of the map, a place called Heracleopolis. It's a wrong pronunciation, I know, so I'm being told by my own students as I taught this week. Do we associate this with burial? Do we associate with the ancient Egyptians 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, burying goats, people, elephants, dogs, baboons and all the rest of it? Or are these temple sites something very different to celebrate life? Heracleopolis, again, visiting, very interesting thing. Those that do follow me and those that do know my work will know of something referred to as lost days, and we will visit the archaeology of lost days in Egypt, this very tomb at Heracleopolis, but that's my own indulgent whim. God Horus, the wonderful god that brings us on to this site, which is known as the City of the Eagles. The remains of an early temple at Heracleopolis, whether this dates back to 6,000 years ago, more like 5,000 years ago, is closer into the early dynasties of understanding the claim of these temples. But this looks very much like the racetrack or a part of fun that you would see in Aztec life, many thousands of miles away. This is a temple in the real sense. Is this a... What is this? This is the archaeology of the precinct wall of this site. Moving away from Heracleopolis, the idea of these early temples isn't to be seen in this plan. Hypostyle hall, brutary column shafts and all the rest of it. They started off very simple and very plain, nothing like this that you might see at the end of the Middle Kingdom into the New Kingdom. Look at the chart now. We jump now into understanding these temples into the period of the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom from approximately, give or take a few hundred years, about 2,800 years, coming into the other rest of the dynasties to approximately just before 2,000 years BC. So that's 2,800 years BC to about 2,000 years BC, the Old Kingdom. The building of the Great Pyramids, and associated with the Great Pyramids, you've got the Sphinx, and associated with Giza, you've got associated the very early forms of temple. One of these known as the Valley Temple and the Temple of the Sphinx, for example. But these are very lesser affairs than the later temples that we'd think about, more associated with the people, the landscape, and the very being of the personality of individual, building these sites in the duty of the pharaoh, in the love of the pharaoh, rather than being enslaved as we would see 500 years later in the Middle and New Kingdoms. You can see quite a picturesque site alongside the River Nile with the pyramids in the background. These would be closer associated with the people. When people decided to have priests and structure in religion, we don't know, smaller. When around this time, 4,800 years ago, we got the early forms of these stone, proper, chunky built temples. Moving now into the Middle Kingdom, Metinhotep and Hatshepsut built a new strain of temple that was on a grandiose scale. And when we're thinking about the grandiose scale and the new form of this idea of temple, we look immediately at this. Temple of Hatshepsut, and I used to think of this temple when I was a child, and used to watch this film that takes us back to the 1950s, and Hatshepsut being a murderous tyrant, pharaoh queen, Nubian slaves being tossed into pits with very, very poor acting. But this is also a site of where we've got at Deir el-Bahari, where you also get tombs of Metinhotep, another great pharaoh, Middle Kingdom period. More signs of the temples, but you haven't seen anything really until we actually go on to the next level, the next stage of these temples. We've seen that in the Middle Kingdom, Metinhotep and Hatshepsut and various other pharaohs of the period as well being great temples, but now we go into a new period, the New Kingdom. With the New Kingdom itself, as we go into a period around 1,600 years BC to approximately 1,100 years BC. Most of these dates are really approximated. We talk about a period of huge, colossal temple building on another scale, using all the resources that we find in Egypt at the disposal. And this is a period when, instead of building the pyramids with the love of the people in 1 year's service, maybe slaves were being used in the construction of these sites now. The everyday people would not have really had a link or associated with these great temple sites of this period, the likes of Akhenaten, the likes of King Tutankhamun, the likes of the Ramesses pharaohs. This is a period when the great temples would have been very much disconnected from the everyday people. They were so vast, and maybe the everyday people thought, oh God, we'll have to work for these people, and then, you know, we've got no correct connection with the priesthood and actually what's going on. And you've got the construction of these Amenhotep, the two figures of Amenhotep, and the representation of the great Memnons. And then you get the building of these great hyper-style halls on a colossal scale with great columns, the sense of disconnection with the people. But more about this period of the New Kingdom and its great temples next week. We're obviously visiting Angkor Wat in the near future, and also next week in particular we'll be visiting the Etruscans. Thanks for watching this video log today, and subscribe. Thank you.